Ryan Beagan, Vice President of Virtual Production at Warner Media, engaged a group of 7 USC students and recent alumni in a 1-hour discussion of the post-pandemic future of virtual production. Here are 8 minutes of highlights from the session.
Using real-time computer graphics, basically from motion capture through to finally using game engines, getting into lighting, and really finding ways to bring in all the disciplines that work on a traditional feature where you're just shooting film into this world where you could bring those same people into a collaborative environment and work in real time. That world really kind of has hit a inflection point with two things, which are one, game engines getting to the point where they can render something that is photoreal, that has caused productions like The Mandalorian to explore using LED screens, and also the pandemic, which really forced the issue on a lot of the pieces that we were using in like infancy ways of collaborating in real time inside of a room on a local network. Suddenly it was a necessity to move those workflows forward in the pandemic and find ways to do that remotely.
For my senior production capstone, that we shot about a half hour of a comedy pilot all virtually, like nobody was there with the actors, which was very interesting, especially after a few years of just, traditional production. We had 2 cameras set up pretty much, like one would see the entire set and one would be hooked up to the Filmic Pro app that we shipped every actor an iPhone, and they were like basically on Zoom in 2 different places, and we did it all through Zoom. The DP had to kind of basically instruct the actors how to set up the lights and where to set them up. Same with production design. The actors took us with Zoom on like location scouting throughout their house, because USC was very strict about like nobody is allowed to interact with anybody else in this environment. It was definitely a lot more work on the front end and the back end, because then we had to basically splice the actors together. When we did audition the actors remotely, it was a lot easier to see them in real time as they came across on like a screen, rather than having to like get a different impression of them in person and then like go back and watch the tapes and maybe get like a different take on how they came across than what you saw. Like, I think our collaborative spirit was very civil and like everybody knew what their responsibility was, and so people just kind of like took that really seriously, and they tried to execute it as best as they could. Like, nobody felt afraid to kind of speak up, and it wasn't ever like a negative repercussion for stepping out of like your work, I guess. Really great editors. They were also on set at the time, which I think was interesting. Like, the editors, I hadn't really seen that before, and they would sometimes pop in and contribute as to how to set up the scenes so that like the VFX could be the most effective in making them look like they were in the same room. And we also had writers on set that if a line wasn't working or if they had alternate takes to contribute that, which I also hadn't seen before. Those were all really positive aspects.
Were they physically on set?
No, they were like all in the call, all in the Zoom call.
On the virtual sets I have worked on, both as on the production side as well as an acting side, there's been a explosion of actors' talent, knowledge of what we do. You can tell if someone has worked on a virtual set before because they know the tricks, and in some ways that might be a leveling, in that we all have to speak the same language, and we didn't have to before.
I think throughout the whole COVID compliance timeline, something that was really important, I think will definitely be taken away, is scheduling, because previously in different sets that I've been on, the timeline or scheduling was not as efficient as it is now. So for example, when checking in people, instead of creating a bottleneck of people who come in at the same time, like spacing them out, in order to efficiently check them in and safely check them in. Basically just a lot of organizational things that I think will be carried on to the future. I know that a couple of film sets have editors in real time, so they would just call in with editors from their own home, so they don't have to be on set. And there was even some talk of maybe like the director being offset so that she or he could look at what's being shot from the camera screen instead of physically being there.
But it's been a really interesting journey to see how productions that historically are not super quick to adopt new technology or any technology have changed, in some ways becomes more streamlined, whether it be scheduling or different adoption of technology. I think it's been really interesting to see.
Doing physical stuff, like for example, when we have playtests, we don't need to actually invite people, or when we are trying to collaborate, we can just hop on a call. It's not very good for creativity process. It turns into something like note-taking, writing down things instead of actually thinking of anything new or creative.
The writer's room is gone virtual, and it's not as effective. To be honest with you, it's become very scheduled, very notes-based, as opposed to all of us, like with some notebooks, with our computers sitting around trying to work on a script, and then being able to bounce ideas back and forth. What it's really become is writing a draft and then giving notes, and it's very impersonal. In some ways, it's effective. That human connection that we've lost.
I'm a TA for a computer science class, and I found that it's so much harder to collaboratively develop any sort of programming tools or anything virtually. Anything collaborative is just drastically hindered. And I think it's probably for the same reason that Michelle was talking about, like the idea of having a connection outside of working together helps the process of working together.
You're studying immersive media. Have you done any sort of TA work with other students in a virtual room where you could have a shared whiteboard and a shared screen?
We have not, no. It's literally just like introduction to computer science in a Zoom call with kids coming in for help, sharing their screen.
Okay.
Nothing quite so fancy, but a year in, I certainly wish that was an option.
I could go for ages talking about this stuff, so I really appreciate everybody's insight.